Justin, let's talk about Barbados.
All right, allow me to do this. Yes, well, in Barbados this week, the incoming British monarch, King Charles the Green, dropped in for a visit, and he wasn't there to hand out honours or to wave at grateful subjects as he drove through the narrow roads in his Bentley. He was there to say goodbye to Barbados, because another country has now projected itself into the modern age by dropping the royal family. And Australia, we Australians are kind of sitting back and watching, and I think a lot of us are wondering why we haven't found a reason to do the same thing long ago. Because in this country, I think the reason behind it is there is just no passion to become a republic. We've been through world wars with the British, we have been in love with the Queen for years, and we mostly enjoy the connection with the royal family, even though most of them seem to be stark raving mad, and at least one of them is under investigation by the FBI. But we've never really harnessed the enthusiasm for change. There's never been a revolution, and it looks like there is never going to be one. And I've got to admit to you that I flip-flop over the Republican debate, because there are times in my life that I've been incredibly passionate about becoming a republic and changing, and I've felt that it's time that we grow up and scrape away the dead skin of the British royals and become our very own country. But then I turn around and I get a little older, or I just change my view, and I go through times when I see the unrest in other parts of the world, and I realise that stability is a very delicate thing. So if we're already stable, we should be damn careful about fiddling with a system that is currently working. It's kind of the old "if it ain't broke, then don't fix it" argument, which I hate normally, but it has merit in the Republic debate, because we could really bugger things up if we went for the wrong model. The most important thing is not just who the head of state is, but it's the whole model that sits around it. If there aren't proper checks and balances in the new system, we could find ourselves in more trouble than we ever dreamed of. And my biggest concern is that the people who are currently pushing for republic, like the Australian Republican movement, only really want to make the change at the top, leaving the system underneath pretty much the way it is now. And look, I've got to say, I just don't think that's good enough. I don't just want a republic when we become one, if we become one. I want to have a better country, because as things are at the moment, there are three things that I would love to change in Australia. First, I'd like to stop allowing a handful of party hacks from being able to dismiss a Prime Minister after making a few calls and getting the numbers. Second, we need to make it harder for dimwits to get elected into the Senate, because this shonky preference deal system has some people in the red seats who would barely qualify as the secretary of a bowls club, let alone as senators. And third, we need to have a system that holds our judges in the courts to better account. I mean, particularly here in the state of Victoria, we have seen a panoply of blunders from our judges, sending the wrong people to prison and keeping the dangerous ones out of prison. And when these judges get it wrong, there is just no recourse. They've got a job for life, and when they bugger it up, they just sit down and they go along to the next case. It is just far too easy. So if we're going to change the country, let's change it properly, and let's make it something that we can be proud of, something the rest of the world will want it to be. And meanwhile, Prince Charles continues to be a passionate campaigner over climate change. And I've got to say, personally, I applaud him for it. If we had a few people like him, a few more people like him in different parts of the world, then the planet wouldn't be as buggered as it is. But this has made him far more political than his mother ever was. Very soon, we'll know if that will help or hinder the prospects of Australia ever becoming a republic. Michael, my old friend, I was just wondering if you're a Republican. Where do you sit on all of this?
Funnily enough, no, I'm not. But I enjoyed the editorial. I thought it was actually quite balanced in what I've heard generally from people who are pro a republic, because it does tease out the real issues. And the real issue is, well, what model do we want? Now, you talk to the Republican movement, they want to, as you say, tinker around with the rubies and the emeralds and the crown. But really, I think most Australians, as we've all said in the previous topic, we all sense there are problems in our democratic system. The role of the monarch isn't really one of them. In fact, it's basically been flawless in the scheme of things. And where the problems are has really not much to do with that particular aspect of the constitutional system at all. So I think we'd be potentially, as you say, if we get the model wrong, buggering up something that does work whilst leaving the things that are buggered, which I don't think is really a sensible step in any direction. I just make the point on the Barbados aspect of all of this. What happened in Barbados is actually a dream scenario for the Republicans in Australia that the Turnbull set, because in Barbados, the people didn't get a say. This was the politicians deciding that they would have a republic, whatever the people thought was immaterial. Whereas in other Caribbean countries, where the public have had a say, despite the desire for the politicians or the political class to have a republic, they voted no. So maybe the Barbadian politicians thought, well, we won't have that risk, and they just pushed it through. There is no doubt that if it were up to the politicians of today, or in fact of the previous 3 or 4 decades, Australia would have been a republic. The public don't see it the same way. And I think, Justin, they've picked up on some of the things you've touched on there. In particular, the model is missing. And it's simply not good enough to say, well, look, we need to grow up or mature. I think the reality is Australia's a pretty grown-up, mature kind of place. A lot of people want to come here to live. Can't be that bad. And a mature, grown-up people, even if the head of state isn't one of us that is born here, but if the system's working well with that in place, I think a mature, grown-up people recognise that and look for the problems where they are.
Absolutely. Carol, thanks, mate. Carolee, what do you think? Are you? I've got to get it out of the way first. Are you a Republican, or where do you sit on this?
Well, I'm a flip-flopper like you are, Justin, and also Michael, and I'm sitting here listening to both of you thinking, oh, they're all the lines I was going to say, spot on. What I think is important is that we know that there will be change. And I think at the moment, while the Queen is still alive, I think it's better to just let it be as it is. But I think the most important thing, which Michael also brought up, is that the Republicans, they have to make sure that they've got the right model in place. Remember, the last referendum failed because it was too nebulous with what the question was. I just think also at the moment, and I hate to hark back onto it, but I think at the moment Australia has far more important things to focus on given this pandemic. At the moment, we're 2 completely separate countries, Western Australia versus the eastern states, and we don't know where this is going to end up. There's been a complete fracturing, and I really think that is what Australia's focus should be on. And it's like everything, the Republican issue, changing the date of Australia Day. There's always something that someone wants to do. I think we really need to shine the spotlight, and we really need to have a look at how a lot of state premiers are currently acting, have acted in the past, and something really needs to be put in place that should we ever, which we will in time, it might be 20, 30, 40 years down the track, that should we ever face another pandemic, that what has happened in the last 2 years should never, ever happen again.
Carolee, I've got to say, I really admire your passion, and I would never, ever be so presumptuous as to tell you what you should be caring about. But I think the Republican debate can go a little bit deeper than that. It can be about giving Australia, all of Australia, the West and the East, a real sense of itself, a sense of pride in its own country. But again, I'm certainly not going to argue with you what you should care about. Tanveer, I want to ask you in a moment if you are a Republican and how you feel about that. But how do you feel about Prince Charles becoming far more political than his mother ever was?
It's a tough one, isn't it, in the monarchy? I mean, look, I guess with the climate change debate, I still feel like I'm not sure it entirely helps, because it does give it that sense of the sort of, again, so you call it the elite, if you like. A lot of people are the billionaires or the people with most rarefied sort of atmospheres taking these positions. I mean, look, I think Duke of Edinburgh, he had big involvement in the environment, etc. So they see it as a natural extension of that. So, look, I don't mind them having causes, but I think where the causes is so at the centre of politics, I do think that takes away from the independence of the monarchy. And I think it puts him in a tougher position, as you said, compared to the Queen. And look, I mean, Justin, look, I am very much a Republican, so I'm a strong supporter of that. It's interesting in countries like Barbados, and I mean, if you look at the British Empire, I think the countries, I guess, that were more strongly, say, the developing world, you know, like, say, India or parts of Africa, or, you know, where they had this real deep history of sort of slavery, and they're essentially these slave colonies, and there's a much deeper sense of sort of resentment, humiliation, there's demands for reparation. So perhaps the feeling is much stronger in terms of lift the shackles, where, I mean, we, to some extent, we are more thoroughly a British outpost. And I think that adds a bit of a passivity, if you like, for us. But I do think there are deeper arguments for it. I think one of the big crises of a lot of Western societies now is collective identity. And I think even from a conservative side, you can really argue the Republic could be a very good thing to spur a real sense of patriotism and collective identity. Really help us distill, you know, values. And I think that's a really problem now. I don't think we have too many collective values that bind us together. So I actually think there is still a case for a republic, and it is something you've got to take on. You can't. I think you can always kick the can down the road and say, hey, yeah, there's always more important things. But I actually think it is potentially a very important thing in today's climate. Yeah. And while it doesn't have to happen tomorrow, I'm a firm believer. And just make it one question: do you want Australian head of the state? And then you work out a model. And I mean, you're arguing for, you know, significant constitutional overhaul. I'm not sure we'll easily be able to do that. But the reality is our current constitution is a colonial document, you know, like it or not. So I think we're mature enough to take on the challenge of making appropriate but cautious changes that will allow us to have our own head of state.